So welcome to lesson night, the TechValley Game Space lesson night. So what is today's topic, you might be asking? Well, I'll be bringing up the slides shortly, but here it is. It is common tools for team collaboration. I am using a very rudimentary microphone holder, so if you hear a lot of clanging noise, I apologize in advance. But here it is. So again, I'm really excited to talk about this talk because team collaboration is something that is shockingly hard to do. And so I'm going to be talking about a few tools to kind of mitigate the difficulty of doing that. So problem, working with a team, especially remotely, is incredibly difficult. The lack of connection, as well as the kind of like the hand gesture communication that comes with one-to-one person interaction, is often not there when you're working with a team on a remote basis. But even if you are working together in the same office, there's also some difficulties in making sure that everyone is in sync and knowing what needs to be done. So common problems that you'll encounter with working as a team include they might have different ideas of what the project is about. This is fairly common. You might be surprised. Two or more team members could end up doing the same amount of work. This is a problem because you end up doing double the work, and you have to tell the bad news of one of them, we're going to use this work instead of the other person's work. And just generally speaking, that's a huge loss of time. You're wasting at least one of those team members' time, and you have to deliver the bad news of when a conflict like that happens, one of their team members' work is going to have to be used over the other. So generally speaking, you want to avoid that sort of conflict, that sort of overlap in the workload as much as possible. Or you might have a few team members that have nothing to do. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking to yourself, great, my entire team has everything under control. I don't have to do anything. And if you're in school or in college, that might be the attitude that you might come with. I definitely been there. But when you're actually working on a game project, having nothing to do to work on a game project is actually not a very good feeling at all. And just generally speaking, you want to, at least my philosophy has been to make sure that everyone feels like they're, one, contributing, and then feel like they have an autonomy over the project in some way, so that they feel like they are part of the project. And two, to feel that they are constantly busy. But that probably could be worded a little better. I don't believe in overworking, mind you, but I do believe in making sure that everyone feels like they are still contributing to the project, rather than feeling like they have no part in it at, somewhere in the middle or towards the end, or even at the very beginning. I want to make sure that everyone feels like they are relevant. I think this would make more sense if you yourself was in a team project and you also felt like, that individual that had nothing to do. Or maybe you're like that team leader who's like trying their best to delegate the work, but is struggling to make one team member relevant to the project, or stuff like that. So it's something that makes a little more sense when you actually have the experience. But in any case, we have a couple of different solutions available, and mind you, these are tools that tries to mitigate each specific problem that might potentially arise. So some of these tools are the communication channels, wikis, task manager, and version control. I say we'll be going in depth with this one. I apologize, we don't actually go in as much depth as I personally would like, but it is another talk for another time. But nonetheless, I personally recommend all four of these tools starting off, especially if you're starting off with a long-term game project, regardless of whether you're going to do it solo or with a team, because having these sort of tools available to you, and they solve some very specific problems that is still relevant to a solo team person. The only exception to, honestly, the only exception I have for solo developers to probably not look through is communication channels. And it'll be probably very obvious as to why when I review this. But important, tools are only as good as your team uses them. Make sure all of your team members agree on what tools to use and train them thoroughly. If one team member is not using a specific tool that your team agreed to use, then they are going to be your weakest link. And again, all these tools I'm talking about, they are not a silver bullet. They do their best to really mitigate some of these problems, but they are not a complete problem solver. So keep those in mind. But nonetheless, any small bit helps, and I'm sure when you're going through this, you're going to realize why. So communication channels. This is the one part where I mentioned that if you're working solo, you might not want to consider, but communication channel, really simple. It allows you to communicate with your team members remotely. That's just it. So ideally, these channels will attempt to emulate as close as possible to what communication will be like if our team members were all in the same office. So why not email? I mean, email is a really easy way to communicate with remotely, right? Or why not text messaging or stuff like that? And my short answer is I personally really do not like emails. There's no voice support to it. And you'll be surprised, text is not a sufficient form of communication when you're dealing with a team on a game project and you're all very devoted and very strongly connected to the project. If they feel that they really want this project to succeed, then I think you're going to be surprised at how little text communicates and how much more voice, as well as video for that matter, adds to the communication, how much more depth and how efficiently you can get a lot of things across with those. It's frankly too slow. No obvious support for notifications. This one's kind of self-explanatory. And it lacks the flexibility of grouping people. True, you could potentially use Google Groups to kind of mitigate that problem, but a couple of these other tools that I'm going to be talking about, I think does a much better job of basically covering these problems that emails does not cover. So these tools include Discord, Slack, and Riot.im. If you've probably heard of Discord or Slack before, then you probably know exactly where I'm going at. But here are the URLs at discordapp.com, slack.com, and about Riot.im. Speaking of Riot, I'm going to go a little more in depth in it, but there's a certain trend that I have in my selection. Discord. So Discord is originally used for voice chat and gaming, but it also provides, obviously voice and video conferencing. It does provide text communication. I didn't mention that I don't personally like text communication that much, but there are its uses, separated by channels. Actually, I kind of default to text communication first, but if something clearly is not being communicated well, I'll quickly switch to voice. And for me, the switch between text to voice is like fairly frequent. A lot of people, when they're working on a team professionally remotely, will actually recommend having the voice chat open at all times. So that's I also personally recommend as well. It also supports file sharing, private communications. So what I mean by private communication is being able to contact to a specific team member and communicating to them privately. This is a lot more useful than you expect. This also works for voice as well. And finally, a mobile web and desktop app. This is, since I might as well have it open, this is Discord right here. You can see that the channels are all on the left side of the corner. So you can see here, this one has a little different icon than all these other hashtags. That's the voice chat, and you can just click on that voice chat, and that'll put you in. So that makes it really easy to kind of have everyone joining in via voice, because you can just click on a single channel to be able to navigate it. This is the Tech Valley Game Space's Discord channel, by the way. A quick plug. And you can kind of see that it also retains a history as well as a search and so forth. Again, I'm not going to go too far into detail because I don't want to reveal too much information about what's going on our server. But nonetheless, this is what Discord looks like. Hey, and you got a quick preview earlier. This is Slack. Slack is a business-oriented text communication chat, which honestly looks a lot like Discord in many ways, but it also supports threaded conversation, which is not something Discord currently has. I don't think I have anything to demonstrate it here, but we have Discord open right here. This was an old server that we tried to open. When I talk about threaded communications, we can do this by, for example, starting a new thread. There's a little button right there, and when you do so, you can kind of reply to a message and create a somewhat more private thread continuing. There's a question on the chat?
Yes. From Dream Logdison, does Slack support voice communication?
Does Slack support voice communication?
Yes.
Yes. It is a rather recent addition, but I did my research, and apparently it does. At worst, it can integrate with Skype as well. But I believe it natively supports voice communication. And Riot.im. So I confess that I haven't actually used Riot.im earlier, but I mentioned that there's a certain trend that I have in regards to my selection of these tools. Riot.im is a start of this. It is a self-hosted open source alternative to Slack. In theory, it does everything that Slack does, but with privacy in mind. So a lot of the communications are encrypted and so forth. But one thing I wanted to quickly mention is that I did make sure that I added in all these self-hosted, often open source tools onto these slides as well, especially if you're the kind of person who likes to keep a lot of the secrets behind the project or your company hidden, then self-hosting is often the best way to go. You can easily, by self-hosted, that means that you can buy some sort of service from the cloud, whether it be from Amazon, Google, or whatever, and basically upload these as your own company server's own communication channel. Riot.im does have a mobile app client, as well as, I believe it's by default it already has a web app client. I am not certain if it has a desktop app client, but again, if you want to keep your communications private, this would be the first place that I was at least recommended to get started on, to again create a Slack-like environment. So wikis, obviously, with all these chat channels, if you're working alone, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to use Discord, Slack, or Riot.im for that matter, because you're your own team member. So admittedly, that's the one exception I have in regards to these things are probably not useful for solos, but wikis are useful for a solo dev, and I highly recommend using them. I'll go over as to why, but the purpose of a wiki is to to create a collaborative game design document, right? The first problem that I mentioned, the fact that you can have two team members having two completely different ideas of what a project should be, a wiki is a way of solving that problem. To say, hey, look, together as a team, let's get together and say, this is the direction that a project should go. This is the base experience that we're expecting. To have all that documented on paper is always a really good idea, and wikis in particular are particularly adept at solving that very specific problem. Not only do they allow synchronizing between different clients that are using it, because they're mostly web apps, you just have to open up the web, and if someone makes an edit, that update becomes visible almost immediately. But most of them also keep a thorough history of the changes that has been made. So if you have like a particularly bad team player, that left the team and completely sabotaged the game design document, that's not a huge problem because you can easily revert those changes back to its original form. Most of these wikis also provide easy editing, linking, which is a huge time saver, and commenting. Linking in particular, the reason why I say that's a huge time saver is because there's going to be a lot of repetition in what notes you're going to write. For example, you might have a documentation on how to, different ways of accessing a specific menu. One from the start screen, one from the pause screen, one from the game over screen, so on and so forth. And my goodness, it is not fun to repeat that text over and over and over again. So linking is a good strategy to work around that problem. It says, if going to the game over screen and you hit this menu button, then click this to see the rest of the process workflow on that menu goes. So hey, why not Microsoft Word? Unless you're talking about Office Online, which actually does exist. I think it's called Office Web, in fact. Unless you're using Office Web, it can't be synced with other users. To be fair, Microsoft Word Online is, in my opinion, sufficient as a wiki. But I'm assuming you're just talking about the offline version. And so this, that's no good. There's no way of providing real-time feedback, especially in commenting. You need to send when you're making your edits or comments, you need to pull it in there and then send that file to the user via email or whatever, and you're going to have to tell them, hey, this is the changes I've made. That's not fun. It's not very flexible in the linking process between different pages and documents. There's not a very good way of attaching files to Word documents either. And obviously it's not free. So anyways, here are a couple of tools that comes to my mind. I might review Notion.so and TiddlyWiki a little bit, but here are the four: Notion, Google Docs, TiddlyWiki, and MediaWiki. So Notion is an all-in-one note-taking solution. Its features include lists and checklists, task management modules, calendar, attaching and sharing files, commenting, and team member assignments. So let's actually kind of see this in action here. Notion does have a fantastic demo available immediately online. If I can find it. Oh, I think it's right here, live demo. So here you have on the left side basically a table of content that allows you to jump from one place to another. We can easily go from quick notes to, hey, I want to go to the subpage, and that allows you to create a subpage, some links. If you push in the backslash, it allows you to add all sorts of different commands, including bulleted list, numbered list. You can mention a person, mention a page, or I think if you just say mention a page, oh, I guess that doesn't quite work as I expected. There should be a quick and easy way of creating links in it. You can also pull a Kanban board in there, which is something we'll go over later in detail. A gallery, calendars, images, videos, audios, embedding a bunch of stuff, math equations, and so many more. It even supports commenting too, for that matter, if you're looking for that kind of stuff. So this is, I believe, Solo is free. I'm not entirely sure what the team pricing is, but you can check more information on their website. Google Docs. I mean, it's technically not a wiki, but it does support real-time collaborative editing. And in fact, it does that probably better than most other things that I know of. Like you can literally see someone typing in real time on Google Docs, and that is an amazing feature alone. It does not have a very good linking process, so that's the only drawback in using Google Docs. But regardless, let me talk about it. It does provide commenting. It does provide history tracking and reverting. Learn this tool, please. Oh my goodness, it is a godsend when you know how to use those tools. It does have an auto-generated table of content, which is, I don't know why the C is capitalized, but this is actually ridiculously useful. And finally, embedding other Google services, including Sheets, also very useful as well. I think most of you are familiar with Google Docs. I'm just going to quickly move on to the next part. TiddlyWiki. TiddlyWiki is shockingly an offline supporting wiki. This single HTML file uses a note-like interface. It supports creating links that automatically creates a new page, aggregation and site mapping of all notes, and online collaboration support. So let's actually look for TiddlyWiki as well. Honestly, like TiddlyWiki is really fun to just kind of quickly experiment with at the beginning. Here it is. So this right here just gives us a literal, a quick and easy way of actually experimenting with it. You can easily download it, I believe, under, was it Tools? Oh, Save Changes, excuse me. When you click on Save Changes, it will actually download a new HTML file. But for example, let's say the philosophy of tiddlers, we don't really like this. And we want to say like, no, Taro was here, or something like that. And then, sure, let's do that. And we say save. And then we click on our save changes. Then you can open this own tiddlywiki.html. Just notice that now it says file. And you can click on non-linear. And here it is. My note, Taro was here, is found right there. So that's kind of like an easy way of creating a new wiki for yourself. It's quick. It's very easy. A lot of the syntax is already written out. For example, you might notice this little square brackets. That's the way of creating a new link. And the way of creating new pages, which is not immediately obvious for a lot of people, is literally by just creating a new link. So here I'm going to create a new page for myself. And missing tiddler, Taro created. Let's create this. And now we're creating a new page. Taro is providing a lecture on collaborative team building tools. And now you created a new page. So that's how TiddlyWiki works. Highly recommend it. It is very useful for keeping things private. But it can be done to basically save it, I think, on your own self-hosting site. I think the save changes actually works automatically. It will save it on the server itself, if memory serves correct. But if it doesn't, you can always just replace the HTML file. Not hard at all. TiddlyWiki is supposed to be self-hosted, by the way, if it wasn't obvious. Obviously, it works on nearly all HTML website. Unlike Riot.im, Riot.im I think requires you to set up Python and Django, which is not bad. It shouldn't be too hard to do with enough research. So MediaWiki. Yeah. Does anyone know Wikipedia? Raise your hand if you know Wikipedia. All right, perfect. Wikipedia is powered by MediaWiki. If you try to edit a page in Wikipedia, you are seeing MediaWiki in action. So obviously it's a proven tool. Setting it up is not too bad if memory serves correct. It uses PHP and of course any sort of MySQL database. And it supports features such as file sharing, extensions. I believe forums is an extension. I might be wrong on that, but forums is a quick way of providing comments on a specific article, and history tracking. Of course, you can easily reverse changes in MediaWiki and see what sort of changes has been made by other people. So perfectly viable tool. I believe it has been bested by a few other tools, whether it be Notion or TiddlyWiki from the perspective of ease of use. But if you're looking for something that is tried and true, you cannot go wrong with MediaWiki at all. So Task Manager. Task Manager, this one is a biggie. And most definitely, if you're working alone, you are definitely going to want this. It lists out tasks that are left in a project, who is responsible for handling that task, and what the state of the task is in. Also provides grouping tasks, marking a task as dependent, blocking another, providing subtasks, so on and so forth. So definitely when we're going through a couple of demonstrations, you're going to immediately realize how super awesome and important task managers are. But hey, why not a good old checklist, right? Yeah, we can do checklists. Anybody can write checklists. You can all pull it on some greasy paper and so forth. And I'm going to be like, no! You do not understand the true power of a good task manager. Despite the fact that a lot of these that I listed out, they come in all sorts of varying different difficulty and usage. But anyways, especially if you're working in a team, checklists are no good because you can't sync it with each other. You need to be able to see what each team member are doing, believe it or not. And a task manager is an online task manager is a fantastic way of doing that. There's also no way of providing a real-time feedback on what's going on. So, a lot of these task managers have a commenting system inside each of these tasks. That's kind of useful. Hard to categorize tasks. The only way you can tell a task is completed or not is you just cross it out. But a couple of things that you can do potentially for these sort of tools is tell what state a task is in. It's hard to indicate estimates on how long a task will take, and there's difficulties in grouping them. So some notes about the following tools. I'm going to introduce a couple of software development terms, but I think these terms are equally as relevant regardless of whether you're doing it for a video game project, a web hosting project, some sort of maker project, or maybe just here are the daily chores that you have to do, all that sort of shenanigans. But anyways, most modern task management tools are either built for Agile development process. I think checklist was the other one, or to-do list. But anyways, Agile focuses on always having a working project after every sprint. Sprints are typically 2 weeks long. So basically, when you start a project, you're going to be like, all right, so what can we get on a demonstrable state after 2 weeks? And the answer is usually, a board game where you can roll the dice and move forward a few steps, which is fine. That's totally okay. That is a sprint, and you got a working project that demonstrates what works well in the game. Sprint builds on top of each other to reach a milestone, a longer-term project. To support these goals, tasks are often categorized to a specific sprint, which in turn is categorized to a milestone. Right now, I'm throwing a bunch of terms here. This is actually not even about Agile development all that much. I'm sure, as Chris can easily attest. There is a lot behind the concept of Agile development that, again, I just do not have the time to go over. I think there's a powerful tool called Google that you can use a time and need for researching that, but this is not this talk. This talk is about tools. Yes, question.
Do you have any particular text you would recommend about Agile development?
Oh, text that I would recommend about Agile development.
Books, articles, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. These were just kind of things that were told and I was trained to do on the professional companies that I worked at. However, if you do want to start looking for your own research on your own, what Agile is, one thing that is basically standard with a lot of professional companies is the Scrum Agile process. Scrum is just a subset of the Agile process, while an Agile is itself just sort of a family of processes. I should probably also clarify what Agile is. It is not a magic tool. It is simply a philosophy. That's just it. It's just a bunch of text on a book where people are like, hey, let's agree to work on this kind of way. So mind you, there's nothing actually magical about Agile. If you're thinking to yourself, oh, I can implement Agile, it'll solve all the problems. No, it does not. It is just, again, a philosophy. But it is a useful philosophy nonetheless. Some of the stuff that I wrote up here, including sprints, having a working project every 2 weeks, is actually a really, really useful concept. And the idea being that you want to build on top of a working project each and every time you're doing your task, so that even if something falls out, like you're trying to implement this feature and then you realize that it's going to take years and years and years of research on end to even implement, a sprint was a good way to really look back on that effort and ask, is this really important? Can we do something else that kind of gets the whole point across and move on to something else? So that's basically Agile. Yes?
A comment from the Twitch chat. I have heard good things about the book Agile Game Development with Scrum by Clinton Keith. And that's by Jamie. You've been thanked, Jamie.
All right. Finally, most task managers follow what's called a Kanban board design. Kanban solves a single problem that checklists have, which is that checklist statuses are often binary. It's checked or unchecked. It's crossed out or not crossed out. Kanban's equivalent of statuses are lists, i.e. the list a task is in marks the status of that task. So that way, because you can have multiple different lists, you can kind of mark each of these tasks in the following state. For example, suggestion, in sprint, in progress, needs review, and completed. So, suggestion is, this is something we had that we think is a good idea. In sprint obviously stands for, we are going to do this task in 2 weeks. In progress means I'm working on it right now. And needs review is, we think it's done. We're going to send it to our quality assurance software developer or our continuous integration server, which is something I'll go over later, to verify whether the feature has been implemented correctly or not. And completed, of course, means it's been verified. So a couple of online tools includes workflowy.com, trello.com, and Asana. And a couple of self-hosted tools includes tygo.io and Collabtive. Workflowy. Let's start off with talking about task managers. Workflowy is a good old online checklist. These provides being able to assign tasks to a team member by using the @ symbol, nested subtasks, and hashtags. So there is on top of the try it out demonstration where you can kind of see that it's just a simple text box, and I believe you can just mark it as completed, and there you go, you have it all checked out. You can also create subtasks inside a check by just clicking on that, and it allows you to kind of see more in depth. I believe also you can easily attach a task to a person by using an @ symbol and then assigning it to that user's username, that person. So now you can check for any tasks assigned specifically to that person's name. That's about it. It's fairly simple, as you would expect. Again, search. There's a capability of searching here. And yeah. We can talk about the behemoth that is Trello. It's one of the most popular online Kanban board tool, and despite me calling it behemoth, it's actually one of the simplest Kanban tools out there. And it supports assigning tasks to a team member, custom lists, custom tags, file and link attachments, and it actually has a calendar support as well. I believe that's a power-up. I might be wrong on that. But here's Trello. We are not going to TVGS Trello board. Let me see if... Yeah, so I have a couple of different boards. What is that thing? Okay, yeah, no, this is a good place to get started. Let me start off with Galactic Neon, which, I haven't touched this in forever. Here it is. So you have the suggestions, do, in progress, and done. Adding a card is simply as easy as clicking on add card. And then you can add in, like, say, this is a task. But you can go a little further than that. If you click on the task itself, you can add in some descriptions, some labels, a subtask checklist if you need to, a due date, a file attachments, so on and so forth. Once you added that task, right now, because this task is under the list suggestions, that is the status of that task. It is currently under suggestions. However, if you move it to to-do, that means that task is now a to-do task. Also, I can add this is a very high priority task right here. And then I can move it to in progress when I'm like, okay, I'm ready to get started on this. And of course, done when I'm done with that said task. And lastly, if something is marked as done, you can easily drop it into the archive and that'll clear it off the visualization. You can add a new list by simply clicking on add a list right here. As mentioned earlier, there's a calendar pick setup so that if you put any deadlines on any one of these tasks, that allows you to actually see that on a calendar. And you can, of course, invite a lot of team members to assign something to a team member. You just have to go to members and assign it to that. And you can see there a good little symbol. That's me right there indicating that I am working on that task. Yes, question.
How do you mark something as high priority?
Good question. So once you added a task, high priority is just a label. And here, there's a bunch of labels right here. To bring up labels, you can just click on Show Menu and More. And in here, one of these more items is labels. And with labels, you can click on this little edit tool to change the color and what the name of that tool is. Or you can just delete that label if you want to. And finally, Asana. Asana is probably a lot more complex than these other two options that I provided. But for big companies, they're actually ridiculously useful. I would argue for smaller companies, they're somewhat useful as well. Especially if you're a programmer, then there's a lot of nuances that you have with how you want a task manager to work. And Asana manages to cover most of them. This obviously it supports multiple different workflows actually, including a regular checklist, a filtered task list, a Kanban board, a nap board for graphing. So a nap board is actually a graph indicating how many tasks has been completed over time. It's a little more complicated than that. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but for project managers, this nap boards are amazing statistics to keep track of, and the weekly summary report. There's like a common method to do that as well. And so, excuse me, Asana, which I believe is .com. I don't think they have a demo version of it. Do they? Nope, you're supposed to write it in there. Darn. There are some images. So you can see this is the Kanban board I was talking about earlier. It works as exactly like you would expect from Trello. And this is the task list right here where it's a simple checkbox system. Whichever method workflow that you happen to like, it is possible to mix and match between team members. What matters is making sure that everyone agrees on how to use it. Again, it is, compared to the previous two tools, significantly more complex, but the flexibility and the complexity is kind of the point because it is meant to be a flexible tool between different sort of workflows for team members that doesn't like Kanban boards might use it as a checklist and vice versa. Taigo.io. I believe it's an alternative to Asana. It's a self-hosted task management service that, again, you can just if you want to keep all of your information private, that's a good and easy software that you can install on your computer. It has a regular checklist, of course. It also has a Kanban board, as mentioned earlier, and nap board, filter task list, so on and so forth. Again, it is kind of a competitor in a lot of ways to Asana. Collabtive is actually, I'm kind of hoarding in Collabtive because it's not very active right now, but it is a self-hosted task manager. And in my personal opinion, it's one of the easiest self-hosted task managers there are to use. It uses a good old simple checklist system, but my goodness does it do it well. It also has file sharing, instant messaging, and contact sharing. It has quite an extensive amount of features in regards to synchronizing information between different task members. There are plugin support, but all the plugins that I am aware of for this service are paid. So yeah, those are all the task management tools. And we're going to now move on to version control. All the previous stuff, I'm sure by me explaining this is what you can use it for, were pretty self-explanatory. Version control is a little difficult to explain. So I'm going to try my best to see if I can make it clear and obvious in the layman words. But, Twitch chat and everyone here in the room, please let me know if anything needs clarification. So version control, also known as source control management or SCM, is a common it's commonly a command line tool, actually. But don't worry, there are plenty of apps to kind of work around that problem so that it's comparably more easier to use for just a normal person. And it is actually a client and server tool. I'll go into long story short, it means it has a client version and a server version of that tool, and really the whole purpose of version control is that it's a database of all the history and the changes that have been made on a project. It literally keeps track of what changes has been made on the project's assets, in short. Each tool has various capabilities of merging files, especially text and code. It is a very magical tool. I like to describe it as, let's get a quick show of hands here. Who here have used Dropbox before? Who here have used Google's backup and sync desktop client? Yes, technically. I hesitate to use the term Google Drive because that's just most people just use that as an online storage, but Dropbox in particular is a little more apt in comparison. So Dropbox is important in that if you have multiple different computers, so long as you have internet connection in the Dropbox client, you can devote one folder, albeit with limited memory space, one folder to synchronize files between those multiple computers, correct? Right? Is anyone not familiar with that concept? So with Dropbox, so long as your computer is connected online, it allows multiple computers to synchronize one single folder content so that each of them are synchronized. Now, I like to actually compare version controls to Dropbox because essentially it has that functionality plus more. But one of the key concepts that a lot of people don't kind of realize when they're transitioning from Dropbox to version control is that with version control, you control when and how your project, that folder that you're devoting to, gets synchronized. So that process is actually manual. Whereas Dropbox, if you drop a file in, it'll check periodically and then tell the online server, hey, this new file has been added in. You should pull it in there. Or if you delete a file, this file has been deleted. You should take it out from the server. Instead of doing that with version control, you need to explicitly tell it a new file has been added. Please upload it to the server. Or someone else has uploaded a new file according to their email. I want you to download that for me. That timing is based on, those commands are something that you yourself have to enter. Does that make sense so far? Now, I mentioned that it actually is capable of multiple different concepts, but let's see if I can also talk about what these features are. First off, with version control, they can reverse any and all changes, including deletion, renaming, file modifications, so on and so forth. It is literally possible with version control to revert all of your projects back to its initial, there are no files in this project state, which pretty much is how almost every project starts. You cannot do this with Dropbox. Dropbox does allow you to reverse changes such as deletion and file modifications, but that history is limited. And I don't think even in the paid version, it contains infinite history. So version control has that one that going for it. It has an infinitely long, of course, by infinite, I mean however much your computer and the server can contain, long history. It can also see details on who made what changes on what files per what's called revision in that history. You can also bookmark specific points in that history. Great for marking releases. And also great for, remember how I mentioned that you can revert a project all the way back to a certain point. So let's say, for example, your game project has 2 different releases, version 1 and version 2. And somebody complains, there's a bug in version 1. Then what you can do is you can go back, you can use a version control to revert a project all the way back to a version 1 point using the bookmark system. It's called tags, by the way, using a tag system. And then once it returns back to that point, you can compile that code and verify to see whether that whether that bug exists or not, and discover why. So it is incredibly useful for that purpose. It's called branching when I talk about this. It provides sandboxes to experiment with new features and enhancements. So a branch literally creates an entirely new copy of that project without taking up too much memory space, for that matter. It creates an entirely new copy that you can start adding and making changes to. And so long as nobody is trying to touch that branch, like that branch is all yours. You can make any change and whatever you want, and it is not going to affect anyone else's synchronized folders. And that also is a highly useful feature, especially as a developer, and especially when you have like multiple different coders, because coders are going to want to muck around with like every single little aspect of things. So having having each programmer own their own sandboxes is incredibly useful. And not only that, but it has merging capabilities for code, that is text files, as well. Merging image files is comparably not pleasant, and I don't think most of the tools that I'm going to be introducing does that at all. It simply just says here, okay, this is a version of the binary file, this is another version of the binary file, no merging whatsoever. But anyways, it is an amazing tool. I am a little sad to say that unfortunately, due to time constraints, I'm not really able to describe in detail how to use them, but I'll try to introduce a few concepts, and then I'll pull it up to you to decide whether to pursue really researching how capable these tools are or not. But regardless, I highly, highly, highly recommend looking into how to use a version control, regardless of whether you're a musician, an artist, a coder, project manager, to be fair, is a little iffy. Game designer, my goodness, you're going to want to have those game design documents revisioned, because you're going to make changes and you're going to want to reverse changes a lot. There's just so many useful and amazing applications with version control alone. Okay, so why not use multiple folders? I do know a few friends who uses multiple folders for different versions. And to be fair, version controls is like having multiple different folders, all just in a single server space. But, there's no way to sync it with other users. Version control uses infinitely less memory than using multiple folders. Multiple folders obviously means that you have to create a copy of each and every file. But almost all version controls are designed to simply check to see what changes are made and store those changes instead, which is a comparably smaller memory space usage, or hard drive usage. It provides extra features like branching and tags, the aforementioned bookmarking and creating sandboxes, and there's a lot of GUI programs out there that allows you to manage version controls and really make it a little more accessible for the common user. So some terms I'm going to be throwing out there just to make sure that you're all aware of what I'm talking about. The repository. Repository is the server, just flat out. It retains the history of your project, like Google Drive or Dropbox. Client is your computer. I'll also use the term local and remote. Remote is just a server. Client is local is your computer. GUI is short for graphical user interface. It is basically a menu. Any sort of graphics that you're seeing, like an actual menu, is called a GUI. And the common tools that you're going to encounter includes Git, Mercurial, and Subversion. Git and Subversion by and far are the most popular version controls, so you cannot do wrong with those. I'm throwing Mercurial in there because it's actually fairly popular as well, and it is, in my opinion, a much easier tool to use than Git is. But yeah, that's another Git alternative that I highly recommend. If you are asking yourself, I want to get started in using version control, which one should I start using? The answer is, it depends. If you do not know anything and do not only care for the synchronizing and being able to reverse your history capabilities, might I recommend with Subversion. Oh, and also, if you don't mind having your computer always be online. If you have a shoddy Wi-Fi, for example, then I'm sorry, Mercurial and Git is probably better for this specific choice. But Subversion is the simpler, but also by being simpler, it also lacks a lot of features as well. But it is the simpler choice, and it is fairly easy to understand. Oh, and also GUI tools. Excuse me. I should probably clarify that GUI tools is probably the thing you want to pay attention to most. Like, I can talk about installing Git, Mercurial, and Subversion, but the first few choices right here, the Tortoise SVN in particular, like, if you install Tortoise SVN, it will install Subversion for you. So you don't really need to go look for searching for a Subversion plugin in that case. I want to also quickly mention that despite me talking about like which tools should I get started with, most of the time it's going to be decided on your repository. Whatever repository that you're going to end up using, and we'll be introducing a few towards the end of these slides, it is going to determine what tool you're going to have to use anyways. So keep that in mind. But anyways, Tortoise, I can actually kind of show a demonstration of Tortoise. Oh, this is actually one demonstration here. Do I have any SVNs? Oh, I do, actually. Yes.
Helen says Taro sounds like he can be a YouTube star from Greg.
What? Oh. So, anyways, let's see. What is a good place to get started? Well, I might as well use the current project that I'm working right now. So you see these little icons, like this exclamation point and these check marks. These are Tortoise HG working in action. It's called Tortoise HG because I'm using Mercurial for this server. If you're using Tortoise Git or Tortoise SVN, it's going to look exactly the same. And the interesting part about this is that the exclamation marks indicate what sort of changes I actually recently made. So if I just keep digging into this, it'll say, oh, this protobuf runtime, okay, this actually looks like, I didn't mean to go this far, but I can also just click on HG git commit, and it will actually show me which files. Oh my goodness, the window is really big. But it will show me which files actually changed. And for example, these exclamation point means that these files has been deleted. These question marks means that these files have not yet been versioned. And usually if it's not versioned, it means you just moved a file or create a new file in there. So it probably means that you want to add it. If you check that and say commit, it will automatically add that. Remember, again, you need to manually tell with version controls whether you want to add a file or not. There are a good reason as to why you want to do that. And sometimes you can also mark a file as to ignore, which you can do that by right-clicking and clicking on ignore right there. But anyways, so that's that tool working in action. You can get these clients at tortoisegit.org, tortoisehg.bitbucket.io, and tortoisesvn.net. Again, it is going to be the repository that's going to make you decide what client you want to use, so keep that in mind. GitHub Desktop is another good Git client, and that can be downloaded on desktop.github.com, created by GitHub themselves. And SourceTree is actually created by Bitbucket crew, and that can be downloaded on sourcetreeapp.com. It supports both Git and Mercurial. So here is the very, 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 very brief version of how a client-server SCM works, but this is Subversion. There is the repository, and the repository contains all the history of your project. And when you do what's called a command called commit, you might notice that when I right-clicked on Taurus HG, one of those commands was called commit. Commit pushes changes from any changes that you made on your project from the client to the repository, creating a new revision in that repository's history. So when you commit, you're committing to a new version of your project. A very common saying in the development world is, how often do you want to commit? And the answer is commit often. I would like to append that with commit compiling code. But it does not have to be in such a way that it's in a working state. Just make sure that once you eventually do have it in a working state, that you mark doing so. Or likewise, if it's not in a working state, we mark the commit message as such. And there's also a concept of update. Update is the reverse, or not reverse. Update is kind of an inverse of a commit, where it says you're telling your computer that you want to pull changes, all the history from the repository onto your computer so that your project becomes updated to the latest version. This slightly changes when you use branches and tags, because you can update to a tag or you can update to a branch. And in which case, in the branch's case, you switch to a different sandbox. The latest version of that sandbox, of course. And a tag, you revert all the way back to a certain point in the project. A distributed SCM. Okay, so you might notice that this diagram, especially with the arrow pointing both to the right, looks kind of similar to each other, and that is actually kind of on purpose. When you first download your project onto your through Git or Mercurial onto your computer, what it actually does is it creates a local repository. That is a repository directly on your computer that is an exact copy of what is on the repository. Then it unpacks that repository onto your computer to make it look like what the project looks like. So then a commit does something a little different than what Subversion does, which is when you commit in Git or Mercurial, you're pushing changes to your local repository, but the server remains untouched. When you push, there's a separate command. When you push changes, any changes that are inside your local repository gets pushed into the remote repository, merging those two histories. So pushing is what ultimately causes your server to update. And that is when people can actually receive changes through their, the equivalent of an update command, which the equivalent of an update command is pull. Pull downloads from the remote history into the local repository, merging those two histories. Then it applies the latest changes to the local project. Now, if you're probably a Git fan, you're probably looking at this and screaming at me that you should instead use fetch and merge instead. That is true. I would recommend using fetch and merge if you're using both Git or Mercurial. But pull is basically fetch and merge combined. Fetching actually moves pulls changes from your remote repository to your local repository. Then merge is what pulls changes inside your local repository into your local project. So it just combines the two-step process, what pull actually does. The abstract is probably not all that useful in practice, because in practice what you end up doing is you end up doing a lot of commits. Then when you feel like your project is stable, then you end up doing a push, and then you let your friends know that they should pull, and then everybody just pulls. That's the most common use case. Client-server SCM. So the client-server, this being the SVN version, where it's just two commands, commit and update. Those are, mind you, there's a lot more commands in Subversion, but those are easily the most common operations you're going to do with Subversion. So anyways, with the client server setup, the pros are that it is a lot easier to use. It also has a very specific feature called lock, and this is actually a lot more useful than you would think. Locking feature indicates you can mark a file that it has to be locked. When you lock a file, that prevents any team members from editing that file. And again, this is incredibly useful for very specific files that should not be touched by more than one team member at a time. And again, this is not possible with Git or Mercurial due to the design of those software. But with Subversion, it comes built in. And also, like, revision handling is done on a per folder basis. So the concept of branching and tagging in Subversion is actually slightly easier to comprehend than Git or Mercurial, because Git and Mercurial, even though personally speaking, Git and Mercurial's method is in fact better. But anyways, because Subversion's method of branching is literally make an entire copy of your project into a separate folder. You can just copy that folder into another location, and that creates a new branch. Cons. Consistently, it is worse at merging. Pros with, and I'll go over slightly as to why. Pros with distributed SCM. So distributed SCM actually checks the revision and changes of the entire project itself rather than from a folder to folder basis. So that makes it a little more efficient because you're downloading the entire revision system from the server. So committing is very, very fast. Committing is you're just making changes to your own local repository, as compared to, with Subversion, where Subversion, if you're doing a commit, it is actually pushing changes directly to your server. And so that takes up time. Again, it's doing it on a per project revision. Because of that, it actually handles merging a lot better. In particular, moved files and renamed files are handled a lot better in distributed SCMs. Instead of a per folder revision system, because it's per project, so long as that file is moving within that project, it can actually keep track of what those stuff are. And of course, it has better branching and tags capabilities. It is considered an actual feature rather than Subversion's method of, just create another copy, just create another folder instead. Cons, it is harder to use. It also does not have locking. So any file is fair game for any team member to edit. And so, finally, we come to the conclusion, close to conclusions. But here's there are actually a couple of all-in-one solutions. And by all-in-one, I mean it has a wiki, a communication, sort of. It's kind of like a forum, more or less. Communication channels, task management, and repository all-in-one. So you probably heard of most of these. GitHub and Bitbucket are the two most common competing all-in-one solutions. GitHub, as the name implies, is a Git repository, but it does have a task management tool. It does have, I believe, a Kanban board, if memory serves correct. It does have wiki, all that sort of shenanigans. Bitbucket, same story. It also comes with a continuous integration server as well, which I'll go slightly in depth. And Microsoft Teams apparently is something that was recommended to me, which is an all-in-one solution. I don't think it has a repository per se, but it does have forums. It does have instant messaging. It does have a wiki, all that good stuff. Some self-hosted tools that I highly recommend. Redmine, which is made out of Ruby on Rails, so make sure that you have Ruby installed on your system server before you're getting started on it. That is personally my recommendation. It takes a little while for it to set up with Git or Subversion. It needs a little bit of help there, but yeah, it's useful regardless. It is incredibly capable for a task management system. I think within the support of extensions and a few free ones, you can turn it into a Kanban board if you want to. By default, it basically looks like a normal checklist. I think it is a checklist with multiple status that you can apply on, and so forth. Fabricator was another one that I see a lot of online resources recommend. It is similar to the Microsoft Teams. Does not have any repository capabilities to it. Unlike Redmine does have repository creation capabilities, but nonetheless, it's probably better than Redmine at task management and wiki capabilities. And then there's Fossil. Yes, Fossil. Fossil is incredibly obscure, but I would recommend it nonetheless. If you're just like, I don't know any of these tools at all, and I am okay with learning some really obscure tools, then might I recommend Fossil? Fossil is a version control. It also is a bug tracker, a wiki, and a forum all in one. And my goodness, it is both powerful, crazy, and clearly not made for very, very large companies. But for a small team, it might be very useful. It just uses a CGI script to host a repository online. Creating a new repository is as simply as just copying that file over. It's ridiculously simple to use. It is a command line only tool. That is its main biggest drawback. Some GUI tools has been made, and it is recommended to play around with it. But because of the relative lack of popularity with the tool, there isn't many that I personally would recommend. So if you're comfortable with using command line, it is perfectly usable. It has some fantastic commands to make the process a lot easier to use. Commit, for example, automatically pushes by default, which is a godsend. So give it a shot and see what you think. All right, other tools to consider, and I swear this is, we are winding down on this very long lecture. Some tools that you might want to consider include a content management system. This is more for, actually having a public website, but you might be asking, what is a CMS? And a CMS is a blog. Yep, that's pretty much it. What it really is it's a server where you can upload things such as text, description, media, and so forth. But most of them are designed with a blog in mind, such as WordPress, Drupal, Ghost, and Grav. So, this might be really good to have as your own website. They are designed to be very easy to use. The only difficult part would be the installation process. Once you get over that hump, the rest of it is smooth sailing. Forums. If, the normal chat client with Discord and whatnot is not enough, or you want to keep those two private for whatever reason, then there is a way to create a threaded message board system. And these can be, some of the very, very popular options include BBPress, FluxBB, and PHPBB. BBPress in particular integrates with WordPress really well. So if you already have a WordPress website, then I would recommend BBPress because it's just a plugin. I have a soft spot for FluxBB because it looks nice, but PHPBB is by far more popular than that. There's actually a lot of different options for forums, so I highly, highly recommend researching for more. These are the ones that I personally find the easiest to use, but they also have a very 90s feel to it. So if you're looking for something more modern, something more like Stack Overflow UI design, there are plenty of options out there. Continuous integration server. Oh, I've been saying this a lot. What the heck is a continuation or a CI server, Taro? Why, that is a good question, this mystery person. It's a server that monitors if there are any changes to a repository. If so, it compiles that project to a new executable. My goodness, you might be asking to yourself, doesn't that mean that you're going to end up using a lot of memory space, especially if you're using a continuous integration server for game projects? And the answer is yes. but depending on what service you're using, you can actually configure how many builds you want a history of builds you want to keep track of. The commercial service, of course, is build.cloud.unity3d.com. This is not free. I'm so sad to hear. It was free one time, and I was like, this is the greatest thing ever, and now it's not free, and it's not the greatest thing ever. But if you have a Unity project and you have some money to spare that you're willing to use on a monthly basis, then Unity Cloud Build is actually really darn good. It is very flexible. Everything is all on the web and easily configured. And it will build to all the platforms very easily, and even allow you to make a link that you can share to everyone that only lasts about a day, so that you want to make sure that your builds keep private. Fantastic, fantastic tool. Jenkins is also a really good tool. Takes a lot of effort to set up, especially for game projects, but it is flexible, as in whatever server the Jenkins is on, you just have to tell it to run command line operations. So for example, let's say that if you wanted to build our Unity project, then you'll have to write a Unity script to build that project, and then create a batch file if you're on a Windows server, for example, batch file to tell it run this batch file to compile a Unity project. The important part about continuous integration server, outside of the fact that it creates builds on a progressive basis each time you make a change, is that they're often configurable. You can tell it to check your repository once a day instead of every time somebody makes a change. It's also an early way of detecting any sort of flaws in your code. So for example, if somebody makes a compilation error and committed that, a continuous integration server will ping you saying, hey, we tried to build this code that you committed, but it does not work. And so that'll be like really useful feedback. In particular, it is ridiculously useful to be able to check whether your game project works on multiple different platforms. So if you're making a Unity game for Windows, Mac, and Linux all at the same time, then you can have it build for Mac, Linux, and Windows, and discover if it actually works on, if anything doesn't work on one of these platforms, you can have the continuation integration server send you an email letting you know that the Linux build specifically failed because of these reasons. Automated testing. Why would that be useful? I'm just kidding. Obviously, automated testing is, a way of simulating what a user does on an app, or you can also do it for any sort of code as well. If you happen to be a coder, you're probably familiar with the concept of unit testing. And unit testing is a way to make sure that whatever changes somebody makes, it does not break the integrity of what is expected from that tool's API. So there are a couple of different examples I found online. These are all, I believe, self-hosted. There's the Appium, X, and Selenium. Appium is a mobile automated testing tool. I think you need to write scripts for it. I might be wrong on that, but it basically attempts to do a whole lot of touchscreen operations and then sends you back a screenshot of what that app looks like. X is presumably the same thing, but for desktop, and Selenium is for does the equivalent except for websites. And last but not least, resources that I use to find all sorts of these kind of tools. I primarily use Alternative 2, actually. That is at alternative2.net. So a lot of these tools that I've shown so far, you can just enter them in Alternative 2, and they'll give you a huge, massive lists on alternatives to that specific tool. So that's great. Awesome-self-hosted is a GitHub repository. It's just a text file that gives you a huge list of self-hosted options on various different tools, some of them for team building, team collaboration purposes. So I highly recommend checking that link out as well. I would personally just Google search this rather than trying to memorize what that link is. And drum roll, any questions? Cool. Well, I'm assuming there's no questions beyond this. So
Let's call it a night.
let's call it.